Today I will be covering the latest standard event from SCG. However, before I get started, I do have to mention that this was their single day standard event. If you don't know how the SCG weekends operate, then let me show you really quickly. You have 3 events. One main event that lasts for 2 days and is being featured on their Twitch channel with their commentators over the weekend. The main event is either standard, modern or legacy. The 2 smaller events tends to be lower competitive quality than the main event, since all the super competitive well-known players tend to play in the main event on day 2 or just play another format. Plus, the smaller one-day events tend to have fewer players participating as well. As you can see, there were only a total of 16 players playing this particular event. In terms of competitive level, I rate events in the following order: Wizards' own big events, rare these days, SCG Open, SCG Invitational, MTG Online, and then we have the SCG Classic. In conclusion, don't take the results from the one-day side events too serious. Anyway, let's get started with the top 8 standard list from the latest SCG Classic. This weekend's main event was Modern. Alright, let's begin with number 8, and here we find Jeskai Super Friends. Nothing has really changed here since last week, only a few shifts between the numbers of certain copies. If you're not seeing the deck, then here's the short version. You spam Planeswalkers, you clear the board from threats, and then you win with Sarkhan the Masterless one by turning your Planeswalkers into 4/4 dragons until the end of the turn. I would still hold off crafting this deck until we have more data on competitive Super Friends. Of course, Teferi and Karn are useful crafts for other decks, so feel free to craft those. Sarkhan, however, is only really good if you want to play Super Friends. Let's move on to place number 7, and here we have your standard red deck wins. This list being very vanilla standard, the main board doesn't contain any cards from War of the Spark at all. And not unsurprisingly, Chandra has moved to the sideboard after her first week's failure. And for Experimental Frenzy is back as well. I'm expecting to see Chandra vanish from red deck wins altogether very soon. Oh, and Banefire is actually back in the sideboard. I have no idea why people removed them last weekend. It made absolutely no sense, and yeah, I can't really see why people actually did that. As always, I can recommend that you do craft red deck wins if you want a simple, straightforward and consistent tier 1 deck. This list would be fine to copy. Obviously, remove the Chandra from the sideboard if you play best of 3s, and Dire Fleet Daredevil is another card you can live without. Alright, let's move on to place number 6, and here we find something new, Mono Green Super Friends. Let's go over the deck very quickly. For creatures we have different ramp elves helping with the mana, and the Dino which allows you to play 2 lands a turn if you have the City's Blessing. With the mana you get from the ramp, you're able to play the new and the old Karn, land Nissa, and finally Ujin. Because the deck uses the new Karn, the whole sideboard is just a toolbox with different artifacts to fetch, the exception being 3 copies of Sorcerer's Spyglass. Therefore, I cannot recommend that you try to use any version of this deck in MTG Arena if you only play best of 1s. Otherwise, the deck works very similar to what we saw from the first game of the last SCG standard, which means the deck has very similar weakness, also known as if anything goes wrong, well, everything goes wrong and goes wrong really fast. In conclusion, if you want a fun and a little bit competitive best of 3 decks, go ahead and craft this one, but do understand that this deck is quite expensive what it does, and it's not a consistent tier 1 deck. I would call it tier 1.5 to be honest, and of course both Mono Blue and Mono Red are cheaper to make and just as viable, if not more. Alright, let's move on to place number 5, and here we got something truly bizarre. In short, we got a few ramp elves, Hydrokrasis as a draw engine, land Nissa, Teferi the Time Reveler, and a single Tamio. The goal of the deck revolves around a massive Final of Glory and or a massive Mass Manipulation, both being fine options. However, since Dovin's Veto is a thing post-sideboard, these flashy options are less than ideal. Still, the deck looks interesting, but without a bigger event showing, I can't recommend that you go out of your way to craft this one. The idea is neat though. On 4th place we got another Jeskai Super Friends, this one being very similar to the first one we went through, so let's move on to place number 3. And here we got yet another mono red deck, this one with 3 Experimental Frenzies and 2 Chandras. Apart from the Chandra mainboard and 1 less Experimental Frenzy, the deck is just the same as the first version of mono red I went over. And on 2nd place we have another Jeskai Super Friends, nothing to really talk about here either. Alright, let's move on to the 1st place, and here we have 5 colored Dreadhorde, not 4 colors but 5, featuring Nicholas Bolas, Sorin, Tamio, Teferi and Raska. Last weekend we had a few 4 colored Dreadhorde decks trying, and most of them failing really hard in the open. However, with such a small field as the Classic was, there were fewer deck archetypes to go through. To be honest, without being able to see the games move by move, it is hard to conclude anything regarding this version of Dreadhorde. However, the one thing we can take away is the fact that it went up against a Super Friend deck in the form of Jeskai Super Friends in the final, which means that the games would go on for a long time, and the fear of losing too much life before resolving Dreadhorde is not there, as it would be versus any type of aggro deck, which allows the Dreadhorde to function much better than trying to figure out what to bring back with 7 life left, with 3 cards left in the aggro player's hand, which could all be fatal the next turn. In conclusion of the event, there's not that much information you can take from it. Maybe Dreadhorde in the long run can become a viable anti-Super Friend deck, but its weakness against aggro makes it very questionable when it comes to larger events. Super Friends, however, looks quite solid as the new I don't know what to play this weekend deck, taking over Sultai's role. Reddick Wins is still Reddick Wins, aka the deck you give to a Spider Monkey and watch him win. Still solid, consistent and cheap. The different Nissa ramp decks that are being forced don't seem to have the payoff that are required to become a proper tier 1 meta deck. And that will conclude this video. As always, I am Project and I'll see you next time. Oh, and by the way, if there is something that you want me to cover when it comes to MTG or any other big card games on the PC, let me know.